everybody, and welcome back to Humulus U 2022. I continue to be your host, Wayne Scheck, Senior Director of Product Strategy here at BSG. For those of you attending for the first time, Humulus U is BSG's educational hop harvest experience, including not only today's webinar, but an entire month of events, including our in-person symposium next week on Thursday, 9/22. It's not too late to register, so if you're interested, you can find information on that and registration for all of our Humulus U activities at humulusu.com. Super excited to continue Humulus U webinar series this week. If you missed last week's talk reintroducing T45 hop pellets with our own Ashton Lewis, stay tuned. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel soon, along with all of our content from previous years. You can find that at youtube.com/BSGcraft. Today, I'm incredibly excited to personally join Humulus U. I will be presenting in conjunction with Libby Stahl from our RAR Technical Center. Following the presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your window to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we will handle those at the end. Like I said, super excited to have Libby with me here today as we talk about hops and hop sensory. Libby is the sensory and raw materials scientist at the RAR Tech Center here in Shakopee. She has degrees in biotechnology and cellular biology with minors in chemistry and environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She was originally introduced to the brewing industry as the microbiologist at Summit Brewing Company. And with that, I will welcome Libby as I stay on this time, and the two of us present on some hop sensory. So let me get that presentation back up. Libby, how you doing this morning?
Good, how are you?
Good, good. I will actually turn it over to you as we start tips and tricks to enhance your hop sensory experience.
I am Libby. As you heard, my educational background is cellular biology and chemistry for the most part. My beer background began at Summit Brewing about 5 years ago. I was the microbiologist there for 4 years. About a year ago, I moved into the sensory scientist position here at RAR, and I've been learning about sensory every day.
Awesome, and I guess I have to do the same thing for myself and actually do a little bit of intro to me, while I can also make the comment that I've been saying for a while that I think it's time for a new headshot. I'm really passionate about product. Like I said, I'm the product strategist, director of product strategy here. My background, I've been with BSG for about 5 years now. I manage product, I manage new product development and a lot of our product strategy. Before here, I used to work in the CPG world. I worked at Target Corporation doing product development for their own brand product portfolio. I have a background in a little bit of flavor chemistry as well. And I'm super passionate about sensory, worked in sensory labs throughout my career as well. So this is the one food science topic that I love to wax philosophical about, as Libby knows all too well. So for today's presentation, just a little bit of overview of what we're going to do. So Libby is going to cover the beginning of sensory fundamentals and what is sensory science. And then she'll also take some of the hop chemistry and aroma questions. Then I will take over, and super excited to be able to introduce you to some new tools that we've been working on and are happy to introduce live today. So this is the sneak peek of that. And then once we've introduced that tool and talked a little bit about it, we'll be doing some live sensory, and we'll walk through kind of how Libby and I have done sensory over the past year and how we go through that. So Libby, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Just a basic overview of sensory science. It is a super unique branch of science in that you use your senses and opinions essentially to gather data. And no matter how trained you are, it's always going to be slightly subjective, and that's kind of the point of it. It's just very interesting because there's so many useful applications to daily life. Everything you eat and drink has probably been through a sensory panel. So they can adjust product and make sure that quality is where they want it to be. So hop sensory is focused on orthonasal olfaction, which just means that you are going to smell it. You're not going to taste the hops when you're doing sensory. So we focus a lot on the oils of hops, which we'll get into later. So that we can make sure that freshness and quality are where we want them to be. And So evaluation is generally just with your nose. The visual aspect is also part of hop sensory. So you're gonna check to make sure that you can see mostly the freshness and quality. You can see all the different components in their different ratios. But we'll get into that a little later too. Sensory science in general is evaluated scientifically. We collect data, we train panels to do specific things and answer specific questions. So training panels on specific chemical compounds is one of the main ways that you can dial in people being able to detect and answer the questions that you want them to be able to answer. So reference standards are quantifiable compounds. Like for example, we have linalool in the lab, we have pure linalool. So when we are training for a hops panel, we'll go through different chemical compounds and make sure that people know what they smell like, and they can apply descriptors that our lexicons, which are, it's a fancy word for a word bank. The reference standards and lexicons work together so that everyone is sort of on the same page with training. So everyone knows what that smells like. They can detect the presence. Super trained panels can tell you what the intensity and quantity of a specific compound in a substance is. So we use these to check for quality, but also very often it's for making sure that brand specific attributes are there or not there.
Libby, the one thing I was going to add to kind of what you said earlier is one of the ways I've heard sensory described is it's really trying to make qualitative data into quantitative data, trying to find a way to make everybody's opinions, train them, use these reference standards, try and find ways to take all of that qualitative information and turn it into quantitative for the purposes of science and decision making and things like that.
Definitely, that's perfect. And that absolutely blew my mind when I started getting into sensory science coming from microbiology and chemistry. So it's very unique.
Yeah, and then the other thing from my history, one of my favorite train panels I've ever seen is I spent some time working in the flavor world, like I said, and our projects was trying to make a gum flavor last longer. So you better believe we had a panel who was specifically trained on making sure that they were all calibrated on detecting whether gum still had flavor. So depending on what your application is, obviously we're talking about hops. It's a very specific, very fun panel, very fun sensory experience, but there are sensory panels out there for everything. The wackiest thing you think of.
Just at the tech center, we have beer, hops, malt, whiskey,
strawberries,
tomatoes. We're working on it.
I've seen deodorant sensory panels. I have never played part of them, but I did see one of them in action once, and that was a very interesting experience.
I've heard that's unique to watch.
All right.
All right. So as we touched on, the essential oils of the hops are really what gives the main aroma component to hop sensory. So these are the things that we can smell. Each hop variety has a different component percentage and ratio of different oils that we'll go through the specific oils in a slide or two also. But this is what you smell if you take a whiff of hops or hop pellets or a hop grind. Hop sensory is super important to give you a sense of freshness and varietal characteristics, but and you'll use that a lot during selection. But it's also very tricky because what you get in raw hop sensory is not what you're going to get out of brewing. It does not translate directly through the brewing process. So the most representative, it gives you an idea partially about how a dry hop could come out, but there's so many processes during brewing that change all of the chemical compounds that hops add to the brew. So you have biotransformation, oxidation, the recipe itself, which obviously gives us hundreds of different beers that makes each thing unique, but the malts and yeast and storage and aging, it all changes how the compounds and the hops are perceived in the sensory experience also. There are various ways to evaluate hops also. The raw hop experience is also cost effective beyond being simple and quick and giving you a good idea of the quality. But it won't get until like the full brew, which is obviously a lot more time and material intensive. And if you wanted to fully see how your recipe would turn out. So you got hop rubs, which is literally just rubbing hops and then smelling them. Hop grinds are mostly used with pellets. So it's just getting to a finer powder. It releases a lot more of those aroma compounds. Hop teas are basically just using water to put the hop into solution so that you can see what it would be in one more medium. And then a Randall evaluation is using beer for that purpose. So you're basically doing, I'd say essentially a super fast little dry hop. So you're pushing beer through hops and then evaluating the aromas after that.
And I'll say, to Libby's point, every time we have a project that we're working on between BSG and the technical center, and we're working on how do we evaluate those hops, this debate comes up every time. And it's always a conversation of what is the intended use, what is the priority of the project, how much time do we have to spare, what is it? And we really do kind of a risk assessment and a checks and balances system to decide what we're going to do. So there are projects that we're doing lots of full brews. We're doing full brews side by side with dry hops and with biotransformation to make sure we get it all. And then there are times where we're really sitting at a table and smelling pellets and being like, this gets us what we need for this situation. So there's no silver bullet. It really, each of them have their own benefits, and we really flex as we see fit.
Sometimes we work through the stages also. So if the hop rub needs to get further evaluated, we'll do a hop tea or a Randall before we'll do a full brew.
Yeah, or if we have projects where we need to make initial decisions to inform later decisions, sometimes we'll use hop rubs for the initial decision. Then when we've narrowed our focus a little bit, then we're going to full brews or we're going to Randalls, but they all serve definitely different purposes.
They do. I will say the raw hop material evaluation is how most people judge their hops. You can't do this at selection by doing other evaluations. So it's important to be able to do this properly and focus on what you need to get out of each experience. So hopefully today will help everyone with that. So as I mentioned, these are some of the main hop oil compounds, not all of them, but these are very commonly seen words. Some COAs have different breakdowns of the percentages of these oils. We figure it out through gas chromatography. But again, this is what's in the raw hop. So myrcene, caryophyllene, farnesene, geraniol, humulene, linalool, pinene, limonene. They are big contributors, I'd say, to what the big descriptors often are per variety.
Yeah,
so
and I think, yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is where I usually will go off on my diatribe, which is I think hop oils are super good to understand a little bit more about flavor chemistry and aromas and what you might get, but they definitely don't tell the whole story. You know, if you have a hop that's high in myrcene and geraniol, you can't look at a paper like this one and say, all right, great, that hop will smell green and herby and like carrots, celery, and rose. It doesn't work like that. There's a lot of minor components. The detection limits of all of these different compounds are totally different. So even looking at raw quantities doesn't tell the whole story. So this is why this is super helpful, and it's good for understanding kind of where you're going, but it definitely does not tell the whole story.
It does not. And again, so if you see there's a bunch of linalool. That's not gonna tell you anything for a finished brew necessarily.
Right.
So having all this knowledge all builds upon the sensory experience, but keeping in mind that you really need to smell it and you need to know how it's gonna react in your beer before picking. You can't pick solely on the hop oil compounds and what it is as a raw material.
Cool. With that, we'll start talking about kind of what we've been alluding to, which is a hop sensory guide that has been development here at BSG. So we used, all of the years of hop sensory that I've done, that Libby's done, that we've done just in general in conjunction between BSG and the RAR Technical Center. We had discussions, lots of analysis. We developed an all-inclusive sensory guide to make sure that you guys can get the most out of your sensory evaluation. So a lot of these things that we're talking to are going to be captured here. What does it include? It includes materials and best methods for optimal evaluation. So we use, the processes that we go through at the RAR Technical Center, along with some of the processes that we go through at hop selection and things that we've done historically, and use that to come up with materials and best methods that we feel really comfortable with. It's got guided evaluation criteria for all aspects of hop evaluation. So like Libby talked about, we're going to spend a lot of time here, as we do this, talking about aroma and aroma descriptors. There are sections in there about tactile things to look out for. There are things about visual to look out for. So we made sure that even though a lot of the discussions have a tendency to focus on aroma, there are a lot of other things that you need to be looking at. And we've gave some guided criteria there. Tips and tricks to fine tune your process and ensure high quality results. Like I said, sensory is something I can wax philosophical about personally for very long. And I was able to work with Libby and some of her peers over at the RAR Technical Center, and we put down a couple that we feel really confident in that will make, you'll get a lot of bang for your buck out of in terms of using it as something to further your sensory experience. And then we worked to custom develop our own hop aroma lexicon. We have done a lot of hop sensory over the years, if that's not coming out of this. We've used a lot of descriptors. We have seen what gets used more often than not, and we've kind of really tried to focus in on what are those descriptors that we think are used the most, and some sensory groups that we like to link things. So without further ado, here is a photo of that hop sensory guide. So on the left here, you'll see the lexicon of hop aromas as we developed it. So myself, Libby, and Emily from the RAR Technical Center sat down over a few beers and really had a deep dive into the descriptors that we use and the descriptors that have historically used and how we like to group hops and went about grouping them that way. So you'll see things like citrus and tropical that you're used to. But then we have general categories called red fruit and green fruit. And I will say this is probably some strong influence from me. As I always say, I smell in color. But ways to group and think about things. So when we're talking green fruits, we're talking things that are less sweet fruit, sometimes as I call it. So things like gooseberries, things like melons, things like pear, whereas red fruit are kind of those berries and more red fruit. Stone fruit stays, we have things like floral, pine resin, herbal, grassy, spicy, vegetal. The category I love to talk about a little bit with is generic sweet. I spent some time working in the baking world. So we have a lot of terms here, things like sweet brown are terms that come out in my world. But these are these generic sweet aromas that aren't necessarily pinpointed to fruits and vegetables, but really do come out as sweet aromas versus, sweet taste, like the actual taste of sweet. Then we have a category for off notes here and a space for notes. So I didn't say this, but not only is this available digitally, but this will be a print material. We will start distributing this at Hop Selection and our Humulus U events next week. But beyond that, we plan to really distribute these out and make sure that they're getting in folks' hands so you can see them, take notes, they are dry erase, make sure that you're getting out of them. And then on the right here, you'll see this is where I talk to the materials, methods, some of those guides for what to look out for. So we've worked internally with our teams of what we think the best methods are for a lot of those things. And then at the bottom, there are tips and tricks. So the first tip, I don't think is going to be necessarily new to anybody, but just a sticking point of make sure you're doing a really good job of cleaning your hands in between samples. particularly like something like hop selection. If you're rubbing a lot of samples physically with your hands, you want to make sure that you're not getting any carryover from one sample to the next. The best way to do that is just to make sure that you're doing a really good job of cleaning off your hands, using some alcohol just to make sure that everything is getting out. The next one is one that we talk about a lot at the RAR Technical Center, and we make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success when we're executing projects, which is fatigue is a real thing. Sensory panels, train panels talk about this a lot, but after smelling a lot of things, particularly high aroma impact things like hops, you do get fatigued and you do become not as able to describe things. Your nose gets worn out. We recommend 4 to 6 samples at a time. That may seem small, but that is really how you can make sure that if something is super high priority, you're getting the best effort out of your nose and out of your olfactory receptors.
Hops are especially prone to burning out the palate and complete sense of smell.
Hops are a lot in all the things I've done sensory on in my career. Hops are definitely the most challenging, not only from like a fatigue in smelling, but I wonder if you'll see it today. After about 4 samples, I start sneezing uncontrollably. There's a lot of things that go into it. So really making sure that you're treating yourself right and treating the samples right to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. The third one here is something I feel really strong about as well, which is the concept of real food references. If you see things on this lexicon that you don't know what they are, the grocery store is out there. Go ahead, go to the grocery store, go ahead, go to Amazon, buy them. Exposure therapy is the best way to train yourself in making sure that you're able to use these descriptors correctly. There's no sense in saying what you don't know.
Yeah, and we often actually use real food reference to train panels also. We don't need a pure chemical compound purchased from a scientific company to do this. So it is a really good way, especially with the large variety of different attributes and compounds to learn about. It's an awesome way to get exposed.
And then the last piece of advice on here, I don't think is anything too crazy, which is make sure that you're arranging your samples from least impact to highest impact. If you have something that you know is going to blow out your nose, and maybe you're doing some noble hops or some lager hops first, and then going into some really high intensity aroma varieties, make sure you're setting it up that way as a progression, because you're going to be able to pick up on subtle notes of those smaller ones if you get to them first, and then leave your really intense aroma varieties for second. So with that, let's do a little bit of sensory. Libby, are you good? You got all your things in front of you?
I do.
We made sure that we had all of our things in front of us, so we were ready to go when we do this. But let's start. So we chose a few hop varieties here that we're going to just do some sensory live, talk about it a bit, use the lexicon and really show you guys kind of how we're using it, but really do this live and kind of walk through how we're going. So El Dorado is the first one on here. I will say, I think both of us are just doing pellets right now. Perfect world, we'd be doing either grind, or obviously we'd put out a lot of things there, but for simplicity's sake, we're both doing pellets. I've got bags of pellets here. I will sometimes close my bags and shake them up. That's a good way to make sure you're volatilizing some things, warm it, crush it a little bit with your hands, and just make sure you're getting things there. But let's start with El Dorado. So we put the spec up here that has oil fractions and sensory highlights from our website, but we can talk through how we interpret these. So, Libby, you want to start on El Dorado?
I do.
I will say El Dorado gets, and this is where I'll talk a little bit about sense memory, and everyone makes fun of me for this at the RAR Technical Center, and they know me all too well. Sense memory is really important. Those real food references are really important. Your actual olfactory receptors that take in your smell is located in your brain right next to your hippocampus. So there is a real link of food sense memories, and that's why people talk about food memories being so real, because physically, when you're activating your olfactory bulb, you are sometimes literally touching the hippocampus. So you create these really strong memories because of location. So I say that because El Dorado is one where I get those strong tropical fruit notes with that watermelon note as very specifically the candy Sour Patch watermelons. I get it a lot on high tropical fruits, and I always write it down. And it's my way of signaling that.
Damn, I'm getting a lot of papaya.
Sorry, my computer, it does not want to cooperate right now. I might stop screen sharing for a bit and we can maybe just walk through it if that works for you, Libby.
Sure.
Maybe let's just try and save my computer a little bit. So you were saying you get a lot of papaya on El Dorado?
I did. I got some papaya, lemongrass, pine.
Yeah, I also get a decent amount of grapefruit on this one. And I think that's how I'm interpreting some of those tropical and some of those citrus notes is specifically in grapefruit. But I get, yeah, very specifically grapefruit and Sour Patch watermelons are typically what I write down for El Dorado.
Something to note about doing sensory with other people is it is very, what's the word I want? It's, when you hear someone say it, yes. But if you hear someone say something instantly, oh yeah, that's what I get. So if you really want to form your own opinions, be careful to not do it in a group with chatting and other people's influence.
Yes, when we do this, typically what we'll do is a full round of letting everybody smell everything, write down their notes, and then we'll share. Because the flip side of that is you can typically come up with your own descriptors, but then going back to it a second time with some of those informed opinions from your peers can be super helpful because you may
Very
just
helpful.
not have noticed something, but when someone brings it up, it can be super helpful.
And being that people are definitely sensitive to certain things too, it helps round out the whole experience after you do talk about it because you might not pick up stuff that other people are sensitive to.
All right, do we want to move on to the next one, Libby?
Sure.
All right, the next one we've got here in front of both of us is Triumph. So public variety, big fan. I think the official notes on this are peach, citrus, and pine. So when I smell, you know, I think that pine is really interesting. And I definitely get a little bit of earthiness in Triumph. I typically do.
I have the earthiness also.
Yeah, I write it as sweet brown, which is something I talked about earlier, which is in the bakery world. It's this kind of generic term we talked about for sweet baked good, kind of like think of it like cake crust, things like that.
I can see that.
Yeah, a sweet, earthy kind of.
Sweet earthy. The pine is coming more across to me as more of a resiny.
Yeah, it's not too strong. It's definitely there, but it's not something that I think is overwhelming. I think generally, I definitely get that peach.
Definitely peach.
I think the last time I tried Triumph, I wrote down peach cobbler because I was getting some of that fruit, some of those like earthy baked notes, very sweet.
So I will
Definitely
take. Definitely what?
interesting.
It is. I will take your Sour Patch watermelon and raise you peach rings. Peach
Yes.
rings is what I smell in everything.
I do
But I'm
sometimes
getting a
write
big
down
peach ring in here.
peach rings too. When I get that like really sweet, I think peach ring also brings, because of candy, some of that like citrus with it, because I get some lime in this too. So I
Oh,
think peach ring brings a little bit of citrus and peach, that like sweet sour thing. And then the last time I wrote this, I did write down candy red. I write down a lot of colors and I write down a lot of generic terms. And as I'm smelling this, I'm getting a little bit of like Twizzler, like that like red fruit and candy. But generally, I think it's a super interesting one. I think generally that like sweet brown, sweet earthy with like peach is how I would kind of take that away.
mm-hmm. I locked in on peach and I can't get past it anymore.
That happens too. That's a good, tip for the world is there are times where we get super distracted by an individual contributor, an individual component. And it is good to kind of walk away, clear your palate for a little bit.
Yep.
Other tip that you learn in the sensory world, smelling the air is actually not great for how you reset yourself. The best way to do it is to actually smell your skin, your body equilibrates versus your skin. So if you see us start to like smell our wrists, or as Libby was doing, smell our elbow, that is sometimes how I make sure I can kind of cleanse my nose between samples.
Hops are super overwhelming.
They're very overwhelming. All right, we ready for the third one?
Yes.
All right, from Triumph, we go to Comet, another public variety. The attributes online are citrus, earthy, and grassy. Ooh, that's an interesting one.
It is. I'm not getting a lot of earthy. It's really fresh and like fresh cut grass, lemongrass.
I'm getting a lot of floral, but I think that same world like smells a little bit like a bouquet. I wrote rose the last time I was looking at this. I get a decent amount of floral in there.
I can see the floral. I also am having a lot of spicy.
Yes, I'm getting some of that spicy and some of this, because I do definitely think there is some like sweet fruit in there. I'm getting like, oh, this is going to be a weird poll, and I don't know how many people do this. I'm getting like dried goji berries. If you've ever like been exposed to dried goji berries.
Yep.
That like kind of dried, like tannicky thing of lemongrass, but it is still like, I get dried red fruit. So I get like goji berries, a little bit of like, I sometimes will describe dried red and floral as like hibiscus tea, because I get a little bit of that red fruit, a little bit of sour, a little bit of tannic. And the last time I looked at this, I wrote down lemon, which I do think there's some citrus in here, but typically when I see citrus and hops, I expect lime. And this is not giving me lime. It is giving me a little bit more like lemon.
Yep, like lemon ginger.
Yeah. And again, hibiscus, it's like, and then since memories come in, it's going to be like those like Starbucks iced teas, the like hibiscus lemonade teas.
Now I'm thinking about that. I'm moving into passion fruit.
Yep. No, I do think it definitely has some of those like interesting dried red fruits that aren't super sweet. Like it's not berries, but it is a little tart, a little floral. Yeah, that's super interesting. And
I'm really loving the lexicon, just to put that in there.
Yeah.
I have it in front of me right now and I'm totally just reading it.
Yeah, I will say with the lexicon, what's super good is it allows me to go one by one, section by section, line by line, and make sure I'm touching on some of those things.
It's helpful to read all of the descriptors, and then it helps to be able to pick things out. Picking out scents is so difficult. It takes so much exposure to be comfortable just smelling things and then putting words to your senses. So
I think that's another really good tip for folks, is the best way to get good at sensory generally and being able to describe what you're smelling is do it a lot. Even if there's not necessarily a purpose, the only way to get better at it is to keep doing it. Allow yourself to live in the lexicon, allow yourself to experience a lot of different hops, and allow yourself, the piece of advice I give to new people in sensory is allow yourself to blurt out the first thing that comes to your mind and then kind of try to unpack it. So Sour Patch Watermelons was a weird one for me the first time I started saying it, but then I started unpacking it, and it's how I kind of come to terms with some of those combinations of green fruits, citrus, tropical fruit. So a lot of times it's like, even if it sounds wacky when you're thinking about it, like, why does this make me think of Starbucks?
Yeah.
Maybe it's because you're always having a specific drink at Starbucks, and then you can kind of unpack in your mind. But again, sense memories can be super helpful if you trust them.
The most specific descriptors are my favorite. I love them.
Yes, when we're in the room together and there's like a group, a round table of us describing, some of the descriptors that come up can be pretty funny.
But as the official sensory scientist, this is how I have been learning. I didn't have a lot of background in it. So exposure to Hops are hard. Hops are hard, but even in beer sensory or whiskey sensory, just repetitive exposure to it is what has essentially given me my background of training.
Awesome. So let's go on to our last hop. This will be the last one we're going to check out, but it's going to be cashmere. So cashmere official attributes, we've got some citrus, some fruity, and some tropical. So this is a one you talk about weird descriptors and weird, really specific things.
Yeah.
This is one I always have a really weird, specific one for, which is Wildberry Pop-Tarts from the 90s.
Yep.
I always get very specifically that like 90s artificial mixed berry flavor that was put in everything. It's like baked grape, a little bit of jammy fruit, but every time I smell this, every time I smell it, I always scream Wildberry Pop-Tarts. My
first big off-gassing whiff was strawberry banana orange juice.
Yep.
Did you ever have that mix? Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I think what we're both getting at here is it's like a bit of a melange of fruit, like a weird like mix of berries and sweet fruits.
It's got all the fruit, a lot of tropical.
Yeah, definitely giving me like smoothie vibes, like a Jamba Juice. Sorry, Jamba Juice, if anybody's watching, but
apricot bin.
Yeah.
Very fruity.
It also, I spent some time working on dried fruit. It gives me some dried red fruits. Specifically, if you've ever had dried strawberries, this is very much what dried strawberries smell and taste like. It's that like jamminess, but also kind of just like really concentrated fruity.
Concentrated flavor, yes. I have like freeze-dried strawberries at home.
Yes, yeah. I love coming back to hops and smelling them again, because I can look at notes from what I've done previous times, sometimes totally different than this.
Yeah.
I usually get that Wildberry Pop-Tart thing, but you saying strawberry orange banana juice definitely brings me there to that like very specific thing from the 90s. That's all the hops we have to smell. Libby, any other comments on any of these or anything that we talked about?
I think that gave a pretty good basic overview. So it's just hopefully really helpful for people, especially headed to selection. Utilize that guide, go find it, print it off. It's a front and a back, so there's one sheet. If you get there in person, hopefully you do. It is super nice. It's like a whiteboard material, so you can wipe it off, reuse it, take notes.
Yeah, I guess I didn't flash my, it's terrible with the
can't
back.
See it.
There we go. Here's my upside down physical copy. It is like poster board material. It's dry erase. So on the back, oh gosh, I got to put it in front of me. Here's the lexicon itself, and there's a little note section right here. So with dry erase markers, you can take notes right on it. You can circle things, you can wipe them off. Super helpful.
Yeah, I guess big takeaways would just be take your time, don't do too many. Try to know what you're looking for, what you want, pay attention to freshness. Any other big ideas?
No, I think that's good. I'm a big fan of sense memory and trusting your gut. That's usually my big takeaway for folks who are newer to sensory is if something weird and crazy comes to your mind, say it, blurt it out, then try to unpack why you're saying it. I've had a lot where I think the Starbucks one that came up today is a really good example of if your brain brings you to Starbucks when you smell a hop, say that, write it down, and then unpack why you're saying that, because it could be there's something there that you're tying it to. There might be some sort of product that you're tying it to. So sense memory can be super, super helpful if you trust yourself.
And taking your time through variety too. I see people take a whiff, do a hop rub, take a whiff, they're done. It often takes a lot longer than that to pick out different aromas.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert is Libby and I did look through these beforehand and make sure that we didn't come in here fully blind, but we did really smell, and there were some new descriptors I came up with. But if
Yeah.
we were doing this, for a project and there were 4 hops that we needed to evaluate, what do you think, Libby? An hour? We'd
Yeah.
probably end up taking to make sure that we can go around, say everything we're thinking of, go back around a second time, make sure you're double checking everything. We really give yourself the time to give everything the focus it deserves.
Yeah, it's important.
And to the point of the lexicon, so I'm not going to share my screen again, just in case this computer decides to blow up on me. But the lexicon is currently available. I think we sent the link in the chat. It's at bsgcraft.com/hops. There's a link up top for the sensory lexicon. Additionally, we will start distributing this. Like I said, we have physical copies. We're working on getting that up into our system so that we can distribute it out. So stay tuned, but you should in the future be able to request it from your sales manager and they can get it to you in the future. With that, I think we can take it over to questions. So reminder, please submit questions in through the Q&A section at the bottom. I can talk about this forever, so I welcome lots of questions to talk about. Livy as well, we talk about this all the time. But we do have a couple in here, so we'll get started. Here's a quick one. Libby, I wonder if you'll have an answer to this. What is your favorite variety to evaluate?
Oh, I don't know if I have a favorite. I was actually a big fan of that cashmere that I just smelled, but I don't have a specific favorite. Do you, Wayne?
I don't, and I think I would probably say the same thing. Is I think my new favorite hop to evaluate is always like something I've never done before. It's always really fun to go into something with no idea. There have been a couple of new ones like Nectaron. First time I got my hands on Nectaron, I remember being like, whoa, really cool, really high impact, lots of citrus. I also love things like cashmere when I do get aromas that I don't necessarily typically associate with hops, like things like jammy berry. Don't necessarily come out all the time, or Triumph and that like peach cobbler, peach and vanilla type thing. I like when I can get some weird attributes out of a hop that aren't necessarily the classics. So those are always fun. I will say I do always like smelling Sriracha Ace. That's a weird one. I always think it always is very much like lemongrass, super lemony, very unique in what it is. But Sriracha Ace is the one that comes to mind as one that I think is super distinct. All right, so we have another question in here right now about biotransformation, thiolization, thiols, insight into the process and sensory descriptors for thiols. What I'll say here, and then Libby, you can add any commentary you have, is biotransformation generally, and the concept biotransformation is super, super complicated. So there are lots of compounds, some of the oils that Libby put in there, other aroma compounds that exist in hops. Some of them are bound, some of them are free, right? That's the concept of free thiols and bound thiols. When you go through biotransformation, there's the opportunity for some of those bound thiols to become free, so that increases and brings in some new compounds. Some of those other thiols will go through transformations and become something different and look fully different aromas. I always think of biotransformation in hops as a bit of a black box. It really is, you put things in there and then what you get out is always interesting. I don't think you can predict necessarily what it's going to be, other than that it's going to be fun and it's going to be an adventure. So I can't necessarily say like any specific thiols and any specific aroma descriptors. All I can say is that biotransformation is a bit of like Wild West and really interesting as to what will happen, and depends on the day, depends on the yeast, depends on so many factors. So it's really super fascinating to see what happens when something goes through biotransformation.
It is. I don't have a lot to add as I haven't delved too deeply into the biotransformation literature. Just constant research going on. So I'm sure there is a lot of literature, as the question indicates, on each part of this. But I'm actually in a class trying to learn some more about it myself. So I don't have a lot of insight with the sensory descriptors on that, but it it seems like kind of a black box, as you said.
Yeah, and I will say, I love giving inside information into the Humulus U webinar crowd, but you guys get sneak peeks. We're working on a project for new hop solutions. So hop solutions being BSG's portfolio of proprietary hop blends that we work on. And Libby and myself and the rest of the group of the RTC at this point have smelled, gosh, Libby, how many rounds of hop solutions have we smelled? In the 20s to 40s at some point this year.
A lot.
So we've smelt a lot of them. And like I said earlier, we're really working on finalizing kind of which ones we want to move forward. And once we have a bit of more of a finalization, we're going to put those blends through, and we've done this in the past, through a side-by-side dry hop and dry hop that goes through biotransformation through the fermentation process. So we will try and get an understanding on our side of how do some of our products perform. So we're currently working on that. We're making sure that we can do our best to understand that, but it's really a black box. You never know. You can put something in, you never know what's going to come back out. Next question on here, I think is a really interesting one. During selection, do you find some varieties that show larger variation than others across different farms, and a bit about the concept of terroir and hops and lot variation? I don't have a ton of experience with actual going out to selection and selecting particular lots or giving insight on particular varieties. I will be there starting next week. Like I said, another plug for that Humulus U event next Thursday. But I will be there starting next week, and I'll get some firsthand experience with some of those. But it is good to bring up for the whole group of this concept of variation among lot, variation among grower, things like that. There are processes that go in place to try and standardize a little bit, but particularly with selection is your opportunity to look at what are the differences from lot to lot and grower to grower. And it's really fascinating as a plant material, the concept of terroir and the differences that come up from lot to lot in hop varieties.
It is a very big deal, and there are a lot of differences across variety depending on the situation. I haven't done selection myself, but I have done a couple trainings where we had different lots and did compare them. I wouldn't call out specific varieties that are more prone to it, but it is something to definitely focus on. If you find a lot that you like, it could definitely be different than the next lot of the same variety. I think a lot of that does fall back to preference on those, because it is a plant. We can't make everything identical. So that is a key factor of selection is variation also, I'd say. A large factor of the variation would also be freshness. Hops definitely have a shelf life. This is not so much a selection issue as this is new material, but across variety, the age factor does play a huge part in changing all the sensory.
That brings up one of my sensory diatribes that I can't believe I haven't said yet, which is different is different. Different does not mean better. Different does not mean worse. Different just means different. So if two lots are different, or to Libby's point, ages of hops are a little bit different, one crop year to another, there's so many variations. Different in sensory just means different. There is no real better or worse. Everything is up for interpretation. Everybody interprets things differently. So just know that, when you're smelling things, if things smell different, doesn't mean they're bad. Different just means different. Here's another one that I really like this question. So I think it's a good one to answer. Any thoughts on highly dry hop beers compared to other beers? Is there a limit when it becomes a negative attribute? I'll say what I just said a little bit, which is different is not better or worse. Different is just different. But there are definitely aspects of super highly dry hopped beers and some of these sensory attributes that can be seen as a negative or impart their own sensory attributes. So things like, especially if you're using T90 pellets, high concentration of some of those polyphenols can start to bring some astringency to them. So super dry hop beers, I find some of them can be really, really intense from an astringency perspective. The aromas can just be so intense that I start to get a bit of like burn on my palate, just like really, really a lot. So it definitely is to each their own. I'm a fan of very wild, wacky beers. Everyone here knows that about me. So I'll try everything, but there are definitely some attributes that come out with some of those things. There are products on the market, right, that can help with some of those things. Enriched pellets, I'll put a plug for our T45 hop pellets in the 4 varieties that we smelled today, will be available this fall. We talked about that last week. So some of those T45 pellets do reduce the amount of vegetative matter, so it'll reduce the potential for some of those astringency, some of that re-fermentation concern. Things like downstream oil products. So again, I'll give some insider teasing to this group. We did just announce a distribution relationship with Totally Natural Solutions for hop oils, for their hop oil products out of the UK. So things like hop oils can bring aroma with none of that vegetative material, none of that kind of potential for re-fermentation, reduced amount for some of that polyphenol burn. So there's a lot of things that you can do there. It's definitely up to the individual, but this trend of super dry hop beers definitely brings its own challenges and from a sensory perspective, its own sensory profiles. Any comments, Libby? That was me going off on a bit of a
Nope.
tangent.
It was a good tangent. I think you pretty thoroughly covered that one. I will say, not necessarily on a sensory tangent, but it affects the sensory. Is if you have a highly dry hopped beer, it can affect the quality and the shelf life also, which in turn can negatively affect sensory eventually also.
Yeah. There's a lot of considerations that come in with that, and I'm a big fan of progressive beer styles and all of those things, so I love it, but definitely brings its own aspects that are just new. I think we're getting to 2 o'clock, so I might call it there, and I think we've gotten most of the questions at this point. So I might call it there. Libby, thanks again
Thank you
for coming and joining me today. Always super excited to talk about sensory with you. Always a fun time.
It was fun.
If anyone has any further questions, feel free to email info@bsgcraft.com. So like I've been referring to, next week we're taking a break from our weekly webinars because we're putting on our in-person Humulus U. Again, not too late to register. So please check out humulusu.com for more information and to register. We'll be back digitally in 2 weeks on September 29th. We will be discussing those hop oils that I referenced with Dave Hall from Totally Natural Solutions. Again, all of our past webinars along with future webinars can be found at youtube.com/bsgcraft. Announcements for future webinars and other great information can be found via our newsletter and social channels. So make sure you're signed up for our newsletter. You're following us on social at BSG Craft. And one more time from all of us here, thanks again. Can't wait to talk about hops again soon. Thanks, everybody.